to be led by Paula Maust. Paula is the creator of the Expanding the Music Theory Canon, an open access website with more than 500 musical examples by underrepresented composers organized by music theory topic. A print anthology based on the website was released by Soon Press in 2024, and she has released articles in the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy and Women in Music. Paula is also an early modern area editor for Pedagogy Music Online's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Revision Project. As a harpsichordist and organist, she co-directs Music Aspira, the Royal Chamber Ensemble committed to telling early modern women's stories through innovative and concert programming. She performs extensively as a continual player in the Baltimore-Washington, D.C. region, and just finished, as we heard earlier, recording her debut album music by 17th Century Nuns. Paula is assistant professor of music theory at the Peabody Conservatory of the Johns Hopkins University, where she recently co-chaired the committee to revise the Undergraduate Music Theory Curricula. She teaches courses in counterpoint, analyzing musical mad scenes, expanding the canon, harmony, and classical form. Let's give a warm welcome.
Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the very end. What's been a really, I think, exciting and fruitful workshop this weekend. It's really my pleasure to get to talk to you 2 times in one weekend. And so today I'm going to be talking a bit about expanding the music theory canon, the resource I developed, and ways that you might think about incorporating that or other examples into your undergraduate classroom. So we'll talk about my resources and some other resources that also exist that you can figure out with, some origins of the canon, of kind of how we got to where we are now. I promised lots of graphs of numbers yesterday, and I did deliver. I have many graphs and charts of numbers to show you today. Thinking about some guiding principles and maybe best or better practices for doing this. And then finally, my favorite part, digging into some examples and looking at some examples that you might use in your classes in a fundamentals class, a harmony class, diatonic or chromatic harmony, form and analysis, and 18th century counterpoint examples. So the resources, if anyone wants to see the book, I do have one copy. I'm happy to pass it around if anyone wants to see the book that came out last year. Just make sure I get it back because it's like my second to last copy that I have left. So I would like to take it home with me. Also, I'm sure that Julie would be happy to talk with you if you are interested in the Aurelia and musician worksheets that we developed collaboratively based on the expanding canon examples. I'm sure she'd be happy to set you up with
a trial. Yes, anyone. Let me know. I'm actually leaving right after this, so but I'll be in touch.
Use those. And the website itself, if you haven't used the website, I'll just show it to you very briefly. The way that it is set up. So, whoops. There we go. So everything is organized by theory topic. So let's say that you are teaching melodic embellishments and you want examples of passing tones. On the website, they're organized alphabetically. In the book, they're organized more according to difficulty level from easiest to hardest. And the examples are all there. When there's everything available here, for example, would be the excerpt is there as a downloadable PDF ready to go for you to plug and play into your class. So as I very correctly said on Friday, no excuses, but that it is very much ready to use. Also, if you would prefer to have the entire score, then there's also a link that will open up the entire full score. When there is a recording, I have linked a recording. You'll notice that many of these examples don't have recordings. So that's a major, I think, challenge to this repertoire is that when you're using it, you often will have to play the recording kind of crashes around the piano in the class. And so when you can choose 500 really good recordings of a Beethoven symphony by professionals to play for your students, and then the only way that they can hear the music of Hortense Beauharnais because you're like playing and even sometimes singing along with it. And I'm a terrible singer, so you know it is a challenge to this repertoire. Is how do you sell it to students whenever it doesn't sound as good whenever you're playing it on the altitude piano in the classroom as it would if it were recorded professionally in studio with professionals playing. And then also for each composer, there's then a longer composer bio page that then also usually has a works list, and also if you want to search by composer and look at all the works by that composer that are on the site, it's duly linked in that way as well. So you can be searching either by composer or you can be searching by topic. And the composer list also at the top. If you prefer to search by composer, you can search in that way as well. So if you have 90 minutes and you have your computer, I won't be offended if you just like peruse the website for 90 minutes. Some other resources then, if you've used all the things on my website and you're already bored of those examples because you're tired of them and you've been teaching them for too many years, there are other ways, other resources available for finding repertoire, especially when you have students who are asking about finding repertoire as performers. And your students say, like, I'm a cellist and I really want something for cello to play on my junior recital, and it needs to, my professor says it has to be like by someone writing in the late 19th early 20th century to like check off whatever box of repertoire requirement. The Boulanger Initiative database is growing by the day, and there's they have really great search features. So you can search by composer and even in some cases by instrument in that database. There is also, for more of a general list of composers, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but the big list, Ladona's The Big List of Women Composers, goes chronologically from well before practice period all the way through the 20th and early 20th centuries of lists of women composers, and this is just organized chronologically if you're looking for composers. And then two other theory-specific resources, the Composers of Color Resource Project specifically is good, and also one that is called Music by Women, which formerly was called Music Theory Examples by Women, and has rebranded to Music by Women. So these are all additional sources that you might consult as you're looking for repertoire and examples to use in your classes. So onto the numbers and the reason that I initially developed the set of examples I was using in my classes, and then eventually became my website. So I started teaching music theory. I was a professional adjunct for many years, teaching 7 classes at a time at 4 different schools in the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area, of all different types of schools that you can imagine. My first teaching gigs were at Towson University and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, teaching fundamentals and theory and keyboard and oral skills 1. And I remember my first semester of teaching, I went to a liberal arts college for my undergrad, and then I had been in conservatory for years and years for 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. And so I had been really just in the conservatory model for so long. And I remember being so heartened when I first started teaching in these institutions and looking at my classrooms, and I could see every kind of diversity that you can possibly imagine. And I was like, perhaps the face of classical music is finally starting to change. These students are all, many of them, especially at UMBC, are performance majors, wanting to pursue a career specifically in music, and I was so excited about that. And then the textbook that I was required to use for the class, I was going through and was like, that's interesting. None of these examples have been updated since I was an undergraduate in 2005. It's now 2016, so this is problematic, and there's no representation in these books of anyone who represents any of the diversity in the classrooms. And so just for myself, I started collecting examples, and because I was teaching at such a high volume, I found over a few years I had examples to use for every level of every type of class. And I had a really messy spreadsheet of everything. And at one point I remember talking to someone, I won't say where or who, but I talked to someone who I thought was a very educated person that I respected very much, who shared a department at a place where I was working. And I said, if you hear anything, I just want you to know that because all of the examples in the textbook are by white men from the canon, which is fine. I love that music and happy to teach it, but that everything I show in class is going to be by a historical woman or person of color. And the chair of the department said, well, you know, the reason that there's none of those examples in the books is because they don't exist. There's no music written before the 20th century by women. And I was like, I'm a harpsichordist and I've been programming music by Barbara Strozzi and Francesca Caccini and all of these other, you know, women for years now. I'm like, you're kidding, right? And they were very serious. Like, it was still very much, right, in 2016, this very serious opinion that there just wasn't, the reason the textbooks weren't inclusive was because there was no repertoire that existed or no repertoire that was worth serious study inside of a pedagogical resource. And so I basically was like, I'll prove you wrong. And so I started collecting all these examples from my classes, and I never intended them necessarily to be for anyone other than my classes. And then when COVID happened and all of my concerts were canceled for 18 months, and because I was an adjunct at the time, and there were hiring freezes everywhere, I had essentially no guaranteed employment of any sort, and I was staring at my backyard crying all day, every day. And my cat was even tired of me staring at me. And so I was like, okay, and you know, George Floyd had happened, and there were, you know, protests all over Baltimore, but that didn't feel like the right way to exactly, during a pandemic, it didn't feel like the right way to quite do something that felt meaningful. And I was like, what is one thing I could do that would give me a project to work on so that I don't just sit and stare at my backyard in front of me. And that also would perhaps be useful and create some kind of meaningful change in light of all of the things that were happening in the world. And so I decided to build the Expanding the Music Theory Canon website. I worked on it all the time because all that I was doing was recording like 150 lectures all the time for my asynchronous classes, and then I had all of the rest. I wasn't driving anywhere, so I was suddenly saving 400 miles a week of commuting between schools. I wasn't in rehearsals, I wasn't practicing, and so I had a lot of time to dedicate to it, and so I put everything together and launched it in January of 2021, and I was absolutely shocked actually that it became as popular as it did. I didn't know if I would get like paid mail because people thought I might be canceling Beethoven, which I'm not, or things like that, but it was an overwhelmingly positive response. I actually, when I was teaching, I had to turn off my phone because I couldn't, the notifications were, from social media were insane. But here's some numbers for you. The chart at the bottom is the most comprehensive with the most details. These were numbers from 2021. Some things have changed because there have been newer editions of some books that have come out, but these are the numbers in 2021. These two tables on the top I just cut and pasted out of an old document yesterday, were from when I was putting my book together in 2023 over the summer. And so those are the counts that I got at that time. I don't have more info about the specific editions. It's whatever the latest was in summer of 2023. I didn't put all that in because of my editor said I wasn't allowed to put it in my book, and so I stopped making the tables. But these are the stats for both anthologies and also then the textbooks. And so you can see, what we all know in terms of what representation looks like in those resources. And we've all read and seen, I'm sure, all of the literature from educational psychologists about the importance and the critical nature of representation in the classroom and how that impacts the student experience. So if we're thinking a bit about kind of how exactly did we get to this point where those are what the numbers look like in our pedagogical resources, I wanted to do, as I was thinking about this myself, kind of a deep dive of looking and thinking about where did the canon itself come from, right? Because I specialize mostly in early music, and so if I think about the lives of composers in the 17th and 18th centuries, as soon as they died, someone else was hired to replace them and to compose more music. So there wasn't this real idea of a canon yet. Like Purcell would have never imagined when he died in 1695 that anyone would ever play his music again beyond maybe 5 or 10 years after his death. It just wasn't a concept. And so I was interested in thinking about how we got to that point. Weber's writings on the origins of the canon in the 18th century focus a lot on what was happening in England specifically, and points to that as a time when we start sort of having this idea of a performance canon tradition as opposed to a pedagogical canon There's an earlier pedagogical canon, especially of polyphonic music, of composers looking back at older music to see what they did, not because they were going to model it themselves necessarily, but to study it and then to create something new based on what they were looking at in older music. In the 18th century, the early 18th century, Arthur Bedford published a really polemic treatise called The Great Abuse of Music. And in it, it's the first time that someone is sort of really rallying for and championing for playing older music instead of playing new music. He's saying that the new music that's being written after the turn of the 18th century is too secular, it's too popular, it isn't nearly as beautiful as the music of Purcell. Purcell has died in 1695, and so he's saying that anything after Purcell is total garbage. and this starts to kind of take root and become this idea. The Academy of Ancient Music is founded in 1731, and also then the Concerts of Ancient Music in 1776. And these become two organizations that are really dedicated to performing the music of Purcell and Handel kind of in perpetuity, and really codifying this idea of a performance canon. We similarly have, in the 1740s, another similar organization in France. Of course, we have Hawkins and Burney writing at the end of the 18th century, the first time that we start thinking about writing down a history of how Western music developed. And of course, we can pull apart Burney, or I can talk trash about Burney, and also grateful for Burney at the same time. All of the ways in which, his biased perspective has sort of become the only way that we sort of understand Western classical music now. We have, of course, in the late 18th, 19th century, have the first edition of Grove. Also, as we think about this idea of canonization, Thomas Carlyle's 1840 great man theory, I think, really begins to be seen in a way that music criticism especially begins in the 19th century as a discipline to really focus on, right, Beethoven, like the indestructible vitality of Beethoven, right, and all of the ways that very specific composers end up being talked about. I think of on the painting in the Graup book of when you get to the 19th century, and there's the lone man on the cliff, right, with the windswept hair and the dark and stormy night and the turbulent sea, and that's like the genius, right, the male genius of the 19th century, and these are the ideas of how we write our histories. So William Weber, I think, very aptly says when he's talking about the history of the musical canon that if the repertory constitutes the framework of the canon, it's the critical discourse that empowers it, endowing old works with authority over musical composition and taste. And that's, I think, a really a good way to look at all of the different types of music criticism, especially in Germany, and a little bit in England that were coming out of the 19th century. And then we have Thomas Carlyle's great man theory. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are probably the alter material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great man sent into the world. And in parentheses, it should probably say the great white men sent into the world, because that's specifically the demographic to which he is referring. I also found it really fascinating to look at concert programming trends over the 19th century, the long 19th century as well. So if we look at the Leipzig Gewandhaus programming, for example, so you can see at the end of the 18th century, only 11% of the repertoire played in that house was by dead composers, so assuming canonic composers. Midway through the 19th century, it's at 39%, and by the time we cross into the 20th century, 81% of the repertoire is from, and not just by dead composers, but from a smaller and smaller and smaller subset of dead composers, and even within that, a smaller and smaller subset of very specific works by those composers. So it's not just that it's Beethoven, but it's like the Beethoven symphonies, right, and specific ones of the Beethoven symphonies, and more. And others, we can keep looking at all, I keep thinking about all of the meter conversations we've been having this week, but we can do the same thing with repertoire, we can keep narrowing it down to smaller levels. Thinking about how this impacts students, so in 2021, when my website did become popular and I suddenly was getting phone calls for what would be my speaking fee to come to Duke, and I was like, I only know how much I charged to harpsichord. I was like, I need to get some other perspectives, and so I conducted a study that spring that I sent out, I had about 139 respondents. And I was especially interested in the experiences that everyone who responded had had with representation in the classroom and the studio, especially in higher ed. And this was mostly aimed at people who were music majors or were professional musicians or who had gone to music school in some capacity. And what I wound up focusing on the most, there's a write-up here, and I linked this also in the Google Drive, so if you're interested in reading the whole thing, it is there. But what I found most interesting was that as I started to narrow down, I wanted to narrow down even further and to focus most closely on what people who were at the time aged 18 to 35 were saying, because to me that seemed to represent trends that were still happening in the classroom, right? As opposed to people from older generations, you could say, well, they went to school so long ago that perhaps things have changed now. And so what I found fascinating about this study results was that nearly every participant aged 18 to 35 indicated that studying a piece by a historical composer who shared some underrepresented aspect of their identity was a critical and career-defining moment. Some of the responses that I got, individual responses to questions, it was repeatedly implied that women weren't writing historically, and that even if they were, it wasn't important enough to stay in the canon. I also remember being told that women were not capable of writing major works. As a composer myself, this affected my concept of my own skills for years. Someone else said that it was a very significant experience. That was the first time they studied a work by a Black composer. Because as an African-American child, I was always questioning whether playing classical music was something that I should be doing. I've thought a lot about not just representation in the classroom and why we should, of course, be giving our students a more accurate picture and narrative of what happened in music history. There wasn't just this group of 10 really great composers who wrote all of the music and we developed an entire genre of Western classical music from just 10 people. But that representation matters and historical accuracy matters, but that also we're training the musicians, and musicians perform and they play and they program what they know, and people who become board members of major ensembles who determine what the programming is for the next year, right? Pick things that they know and that they love. And so if we increase the repertoire that students know, then we're eventually going to be able to finally start to see some shifts in concert programming. And so what I have here that kind of goes along with this, my hypothesis, so Blocktrack.com every year tracks tens of thousands of classical performances all over the world, and then they keep statistics on them. At the end of the year, they release a year in review, so you can see the top composers performed in the year, the top conductors, a lot of different really cool statistical analysis that they publish. And so in 2024, these were the top 10 classical composers performed in concert music globally. And you can see, with the exception of Haydn, who didn't make it this year, usually Haydn is in that list, but Haydn was not on the list in 2024. All of the composers who are most heavily represented in music theory texts in terms of the volume of examples that they have, all are also in the volume of top 10 composers that perform globally. So thinking about some questions that I sometimes get, or thinking about kind of guiding principles or best or better practices, one of the first things that someone will always say to me is, well, should we just cancel Beethoven? And I always say, no, of course not. I mean, I do teach at Peabody, right, the oldest conservatory in North America, so if I can teach my students Beethoven, it wouldn't work. And I also really, I quite enjoy teaching Beethoven, but I also enjoy teaching all of the other composers who were actively writing music at the same time Beethoven was, and putting it into this broader, broader historical spectrum. And so my thought has always been expansion rather than deletion, that we can expand what we're teaching without getting rid of all of the other things that we've been teaching. If you have 100 examples in your class for a semester and 100 of them are by Beethoven, you could probably still 25 by Beethoven and cover a lot of the Beethoven ground in your class. Similarly, once someone said, well, should I just start teaching Joseph Bellone instead of Mozart? And again, of course, my answer personally is no, you should teach both of them because they're both writing music in different places but in very similar styles, and in very different sort of life circumstances. And so it's so interesting to see all of those Enlightenment ideals in French music and also in Mozart's music. A harder question to answer is how many composer examples are enough for my class? There's no right. I really actually dislike the idea of box checking and saying like, okay, I got in 10, so I checked off my diversity requirement for the semester, so I'm good to go. I think we should always be striving to show our students really good examples of music for whatever we happen to be teaching them, and that you know, a numerical value isn't really going to necessarily make your class diverse enough. Every class is going to be different. Something we've been talking about a bit this weekend already is ideas of how to avoid tokenism, which I think is something to always be cognizant of and that can be particularly challenging whenever we're first trying to diversify the repertoire that we might be teaching in a classical tonal music theory class. I personally find some things that work well for me are that I mention usually at the beginning of the semester, because whenever I introduce who I am to my students, like I tell them about my book and my website so they kind of know like who I am and what my intentions are from the beginning. So I talk about it at the beginning, and then I am much a bigger fan of modeling rather than talking about it constantly, of just making it a point of showing them many different examples and many different composers all semester, rather than sort of taking the time to talk about inclusivity all the time. I think it could work in other ways as well. I find that that works best for the particular students that I have. I also think it's important to incorporate history and context as often as possible for every composer, not just for the women and the people of color and other underrepresented composers. Even at a school like Peabody, that you might imagine the students are already very knowledgeable about Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn. Actually, most of the time, they're not. No, they're not. And so it's, you know, to avoid tokenizing like, oh, we have Claire Schumann today, it's really special. If you're talking also whenever you have Robert Schumann about who Robert Schumann is, and putting everyone into the same kind of equal playing field context. We were talking in the last session at the end about making students laugh, and I try to be funny in my classes all the time because it's 8 a.m. theory. And so, like, if it's not funny, no one's coming. And so I try to really make it a point to humanize all of the composers. I think sometimes, too, we, like, put Bach on a pedestal, and we're like, oh, it's Bach, and, like, everyone else is whoever they were, and, Bach. So when I teach 18th century counterpoint, I always tell my students about, here's what Bach sent in his dossier to Leipzig, right? Like, the first book of the Weltenburg Review, the 2-part Inventions, the 3-part Sinfonias, and he didn't get the job. Like, he wasn't the first choice for the job, he was the third choice. And that sort of, those ways of humanizing the composers, like, as you're passing out a paper, you can give them 30 seconds of context, that kind of makes them see that whoever it is that they're talking about was just another person, just like they are sitting in the class. I also, I think you probably know if you use my website, examples on a regular basis. All of the examples on my site, I put a 2-sentence or 3-sentence bio at the bottom of the page so that there was that context there. But I actually do that for all of the composers, not just for the underrepresented composers. So with Chopin, there's a 2-sentence bio about Chopin on the bottom of the example. So again, kind of equalizing and making it seem normal that this is just how we talk about all of the composers in this class. And then when I can, I'm not always good at remembering to do this. I do it in writing, but in speaking, I'm still terrible about doing it, of trying to use first and last names for everyone so that it's not Schumann and Clara Schumann, but that it's Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann, for example. So here's just what that could look like in terms of bios. So here's an example I use all the time in Theory 4 whenever I'm talking about common tone diminished 7th chords arranged by Maud Curie-Hare, her bio. This is another example I use in Theory 4 whenever we're also doing common tone diminished 7th chords and a few other chromatic chords by Chopin. And both of them have a composer bio at the bottom of the page. It's not, none of them are extensive or lengthy bios. They're short. Sometimes when I'm passing out a paper to students, I will take the time to like just talk at them about the composer rather than, I don't need the bio about them, but I just tell them a few tidbits about the composer, and it's always there so that they have that written information in front of them. So now for the more fun part of this workshop is getting to dig into examples. So there's a handout, I think, that came around in person, or if you're on your tablets or your computers, these examples are all in my slides as well, so you can annotate directly on the slides electronically, or the handout is also in that file. But I want to look at some of my favorite examples. Again, this is a small smattering of so many examples that we could be looking at. I can keep you here the rest of the day and talk to you about all of my favorite examples for teaching, but I won't because we've gotten so many other examples already this weekend. So I actually first want to talk about Fraser Carreño, and we have another Carreño expert in the room today, so I hope you all got to see the great poster in the room about using Carreño's works in the undergraduate core. Here she is seated at the piano as an older adult. She was really known kind of as a child prodigy. She was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and her family became political refugees to the United States starting in 1862, which we think historically about what's happening in the United States in the 1860s, to think that it was safer to come to the United States during the U.S. Civil War than to stay in Venezuela. Kind of gives you an idea of the circumstances that her family was leaving. She wrote about 75 compositions, mostly for the piano, most whenever she was between the ages of 10 and 20. So it's always a fun fact to share with students, because most of my students in Theory 3 and 4 are around 19 or 20, and so it's a nice bit of context. And she toured in the Americas and Europe, including playing for President Lincoln at the White House. And that's always, especially since Peabody's in Baltimore and we're so close to Washington, D.C., it's always nice to kind of relate that to them geographically. That, when she was young, she was, essentially right where they are. She's nicknamed the Valkyrie of the piano. Amy Beach, for example, dedicated her piano concerto to Carreño, so she had a really fine reputation as a pianist. I love this poster for her farewell concert, her last appearance at the Boston Music Hall. Don't miss it, right? 1863, so she's how old? She's 10. Pretty amazing. So this excerpt that I pulled for her, this is from her Opus 18. She wrote 2 elegies. This is from the second one. This is the opening. And this is actually a piece that I like to use in fundamentals classes for a couple of reasons. It's really good if you're wanting students to just identify a major scale, because there's such a clear example of it in the bass. And then also, all of the chords in the right hand are great for getting students to just stack thirds together and identify chord qualities. And I especially like this example, and actually most of her other repertoire, because she's not just writing in C major, and so it's really good to test students' skills when you're trying to make sure that their fundamentals are solid. To like, okay, here's something in F sharp, like can you figure out, right, what all of these, just what are these pitches, how do you stack them into thirds, what are the sizes between all these intervals, because there's double sharps, there's lots of accidentals in the key signature, so it works really well pedagogically for teaching fundamentals specifically. So let's just have a listen to this. Of course, this is a very versatile example actually, so there could be lots of applications for using it in a more advanced harmony class if you're wanting to talk about secondary function and cadences as well. So it's a very broadly useful tool. And really, I think all of her piano music, as your poster so nicely describes, her piano music is all I really like, it's unusual, I think, sometimes to find music that is really perfect for teaching theory, especially some of the more simple concepts of theory, that also is music that you really enjoy playing and listening to for the sake of like how nice the music itself is. Sometimes it sounds more like a technical exercise or an etude, which is fine for analysis purposes, but not always for the just pure enjoyment of the music. And so I think Carreño, especially the piano repertoire, is just so ideally suited to teaching theory because it's laid out in a way that makes it super clear what you could use to teach for, and also, in my opinion, it's music that has really nice sonic properties as well. Thinking now beyond fundamentals and into more of a diatonic harmony class, I want to talk about the music of Isabella Colburn. I didn't show the slide. I can pull from another, actually I will, because we have time. And Joel can go one more. Excuse me. On my screen. I want to show you, because I worked for Grove, I feel like I have the liberty to rip on Grove a little bit every once in a while. So let me just show you something. So, first edition of Grove comes out in 1879. And if we're thinking about, the way that we tell music history now, that a lot of it is entrenched in these 19th century isms, racism, sexism, ableism, all of the different isms, and that many of the resources that we use have been simply expanded and maybe revised rather than sort of rethought and written from the inside out. Grove is a kind of prime example of that, right? That it's this huge resource now as Oxford Music Online, but that it is still very much rooted in this 19th century kind of ideals. And so here is Isabella Colburn. Here's her biography. This is from the 1879 edition of Grove. So she's one of the few women in that first edition of Grove who got her own article. Most women in the first edition of Grove are just mentioned as bylines in other important men relatives. Articles like Francesca Caccini gets a one-sentence mention at the very end of her father's biography, even though she went on to be much more wealthy than he was and she wrote an opera. And he didn't, she still just like a one-sentence byline. Louise Farron is one paragraph at the end of her husband Aristide's long biography, even though she was the composer and the professor, and he was just a very important music critic, but still a music critic. And so, but Isabella Colburn gets her own bio, but if you can see when you look at her bio, quite a lot of her bio focuses more on the important men, so she's in relational deference to all of the important men who are around her, especially to the composer Giacomo Rossini, who did create 18 roles for her. Right? We wouldn't even know about how amazing Rossini was if we hadn't had Isabella Colburn to sing and bring all of those roles to life. And then at the very end, all that it says was she herself was herself a composer and has left a few collections of songs. And that's it. That's the last sentence of her bio. And this is 1879. But if you look at her bio now, and we are in the process of revising Grove, which will take the rest of our lives, but we are working on revising it as best we can, so revising existing articles about women. So hopefully this one will change soon. I only work on the early modern period, so this is later than what I'm working on. But this is the current article that's in Grove Music Online, is on the right-hand side, and on the left side is this original 1879 article, and you can see the format is essentially the same. It's still putting her in sort of, not to say that it's not important to know who her teachers were and who the important musical people were all around her, but it makes the article really spun towards justifying her existence because of these other people instead of actually for her own musical accomplishments. Talks a lot about being married to Rossini and following Rossini to London, about her relationship with Rossini, and then at the end, again, it just says she composed 4 volumes of songs, which she did, and they also exist in beautiful, very legible, clean, full score, published versions from the 19th century, fully digitized, available online to be commentated upon and described at length in the way that all of the other composers in Grove have very long commentaries on all of the musical works that go beyond just the basic nuts and bolts of their lives. And so this is a kind of unrelated tangent to music theory, but in thinking about the way that we are talking about all of the people that we introduce into our classes, I think it's a key thing to remember. So what I like to tell my students about Isabella Colburn was I start by saying, again, we're looking at her repertoire, so it's important to start by saying she published 4 books of songs instead of tacking that on at the end, like, oh, by the way. Especially like, given if you look at how she's seated at the keyboard with music in front of her, that she was a very famous opera singer. She had a renowned 3-octave range. Rossini wrote 18 different roles for her, which is a really significant number of roles. And that she had really extensive performance contracts at major opera houses for more than a decade. So she was really the prima donna in Italy for the kind of primary decade of her career. And so when I'm teaching a basic harmony class, I think her songs work, all of her songs work really well. I chose this one to use in my book, especially because it's in a minor key, and I always like to try and balance the number of major and minor examples that I have. I love that this one is so straightforward. Again, it can be, as someone has said recently, it's so hard to find an example that's just like 1 5 1 5 1 5 1 5 1 4 5 1, just getting the kind of basic tonal phrase model. And this one does it so elegantly because the phrase of music, the tonal phrase model, works so perfectly with also the phrase of text. And so we can talk about, I try and do a lot of vocal music in my classes. One of the things I teach almost all the voice majors at Peabody who are sophomores have to take 8 AM theory, which is what I teach. And so I try to have a lot of voice music in those classes because it's the student population I have, but also because it's so rarely included. It's almost always instrumental music. And then folks are like, well, I mean, we never analyzed anything for voice, so I didn't know music theory even matters for what I was doing. It's just string quartets and piano sonatas. And so we do a lot of art songs in my classes whenever we can. Obviously, this semester we were at a few. We don't do much with art song, but in other semesters we do. And this also has the nice arpeggiated right hand that makes the harmony so clear. So when you're first introducing students to Roman numeral analysis and getting them to look at texture and thinking about how to group notes together, there's also the, I try and get my students to recognize patterns. We've all been talking about patterns this weekend, shocking, at Music Theory Workshop, but I try and get them to recognize patterns as well, and so this is a good example of, you see they've done this measure, and whenever it's coming back, I'm like, have you seen that before? Like, you can be faster by, of course, this pattern recognition, because game fluency is so key. So let's take a listen to this. Unfortunately, I don't find that there's a really tremendously excellent recording yet. There will be someday, I'm sure, of Isabella Colburn's work. There are a few recordings. So if anyone wants, any of you sopranos and pianists who want a really good project, this would be one I recommend, recording her complete works. If you're teaching a more advanced harmony class and wanting to incorporate some chromatic analysis, I want to show an example by Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He composed more than 80 works across numerous genres, essentially most of the genres of his time he was writing in. He was also a conductor. Famously, he conducted the Handel Society of London. He was a professor of composition at the Guildhall School of Music and the Trinity College of Music. And he really was intentional about trying to fuse elements of Western classical music with elements of traditional African music. His father was from Sierra Leone. His mother was a white Englishwoman from the United Kingdom. In 1904, he conducted the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Choral Society. This was a group of more than 200 black singers located in Washington, D.C. So he went on tour to the United States and conducted the Choral Society and the U.S. Marine Band in a program of his own music for President Roosevelt. He was really very famous in the U.S. There's actually an elementary school named after him in Baltimore, which is fun. And he died of pneumonia. He was quite young, as you can see whenever he died. And he was very, very famous at the time, and they say that crowds lined the streets for an entire 3.5 miles of people on foot to process for his funeral procession in 1912. And so the piece I'd like to use whenever I do this is specifically a piece that I use all the time when I'm teaching chromatic modulation. Because we're going from, of course, E major to the chromatic unit of C major, and so getting my students to recognize, when is the moment when we can no longer say that we're in E major, and when is the moment that we have to be in C, and so, of course, we spend most of our time, well, I always try to see if, this chord trips them up. But then, the idea is to get to the bottom of the page and think about, modal mixture here with a minor 1 chord going back to 5, 7, and E, and then when we get the modal mixture again, it's really just a pivot chord of 3 in the key of C major, and then the 5, 7 chord, so that this is the moment, right? Here we can no longer be in E, and right here we can't be in C, so getting them to find that point of where the two tonal areas are overlapping with one another. This is from Coleridge Taylor's 4 Characteristic Waltzes. This is a piece that was arranged for a lot of different configurations. The recording I have is a full orchestrated version. This is an arrangement that he made. It's for violin and piano. I usually use this reduced version for teaching just because it saves paper, and also there's no transposing instruments and no other clefs. And for ease of looking at chromatic harmony, I usually try to keep things reduced down as much as possible because I'm more interested in the pivot chord than trying to have everyone look at the open score. At least for undergrads. Different story for my graduate students, but undergrads. So let's get to around 6 seconds. Many of Coleridge Taylor's works work really well for this. I do find sometimes, right, he's right on the edge of like the late 19th and turn of the 20th century, and so I will say that as a whole, I find that I have to look through his music a little more closely to find things that will work really well with the classes I'm teaching. I think a lot of it maybe will work better in like a 20th century class where you're looking at more extended harmonic techniques and moving a little bit beyond tonality, but there are examples like this that still work really well in the tonal harmony class where it's super clear exactly what he's doing, and also in nice manageable teaching-sized chunks to show your students. Moving back in time a little bit, but now thinking about classical form and analysis class, if anyone is teaching one of those classes, Joseph Boulogne, living 1745 to 1799. He was born in Guadeloupe, which is in the Caribbean, colonized by the French. His father was a French plantation owner, and his mother was an enslaved native woman at his father's plantation. His father didn't formally adopt him, but legally, his father kind of legitimized him and kind of adopted him and his mother actually into the family unit and provided him with a really world-class education. At age 7, he sent Joseph to France to go to a really prestigious boarding school where he was fully educated. He became a violin and fencing prodigy, equally skilled at both physical and musical pursuits. He wrote operas, symphonies, string quartets, violin sonatas, and a lot of their chamber repertoire. He was the conductor of several famous orchestras in France, and he became then, in the French Revolution, a colonel in the army. And one of the reasons that he talks about in his documents about why he ended up joining the French Revolution and taking on this leadership role after, like, when he could have been just wielding a conducting baton, and now he's actually physically going into battle. He was slated to become the next director of the Paris Opera. A group of wealthy, white, mostly white women protested his appointment and essentially said that they would cease giving money to the opera if they appointed what they called at the time a mulatto to be the new opera director, and the leadership of the opera at the time acquiesced because they didn't want to go out of business by losing their most wealthy patrons. And so he was denied the appointment that he had been promised as the director. So he says that was one of the things that really inspired him to join the army in the revolution to fight for equality for all people, because he had experienced this extreme discrimination for a very, he never went on to conduct the Paris Opera, and I think that was probably something that was a significant life goal for him. It was really hard to pick just one example of Joseph Boulogne to talk to you about today. I find that his music is all, like, you could use every single piece that we have access to the scores for in a class for something, and it would all work really, really well. He has his Opus 1 6-string quartets are really, I like to teach them, especially the rondos, because the forms are so clear, like their textbook definition of rondo. They do all the things that we say that a rondo is going to do. And they also have really clear phrase structures and very clear following of the tonal phrase model and harmonic progressions. So they're really very straightforward to use for undergraduate teaching. And I think the first movements of all of his string quartets, I love teaching them to my graduate students because they don't do the textbook of what you expect the first movement of a string quartet to do. They're like, you think you're getting sonata form, and then you're not quite getting what we would call real sonata form, or even any of the modifications of sonata form that we sometimes tell our students are happening. And so I think the first movements, I mean, you can pick excerpts of the first movements of the string quartets for any phrase or harmonic progressions, but as a whole, if we're thinking about form of an entire movement, the first movements, I love teaching those in my graduate expanding the Canon seminar, because everyone comes in and they're like, oh, it's the first movement of a string quartet, it's going to be in sonata form. And we listen to the exposition, and they're like, here's the main theme, and here's the transition, and here's the subordinate theme, and here's the closing material, and then we get a little bit of a development, and then they're like, wait, where's the recap? Where was it? It didn't come. I'm so confused. And we get to, like, parse out exactly what's happening in a structural level at a very, a much more advanced level. But the rondos in all of the 6-string quartets are really just excellent teaching pieces for undergrad form because they are so standard. So let's listen to this one. This is the rondo from Opus 1, number 1. Examples to be really good for talking about texture. With my students, I'm thinking about when we do phrase structure analysis, especially. I use Kaplan, I like Kaplan. Also use Kaplan for phrase structure, and when I'm getting them to label where the basic ideas and the contrasting ideas and fragments and cadences are, I always want them to draw brackets over whichever instrument or whichever part they think has the melody, so that they're really listening for melodic fragments and units of things. And so with these string quartets, he makes it so clear who has the melody and when they have the melody. And so you can, and especially because they're of course broken out on 4 staves, I can be like, okay, you have to show the basic idea is the first 2 bars of violin 1, and then there's another basic idea. Again, you have to, it's great for getting them to really recognize kind of the hierarchy of parts when we're thinking about how we're constructing music of this time period, which is both analysis and also a lot of model composition in my classes. And so we then talk about not just what the harmonic progression is, but the way that all of the cuts are fitting together and what each player's role is in creating the sonic experience. And then finally, 18th century counterpoint, which I love teaching. I don't know how many people still teach an 18th century counterpoint class, but I really enjoy teaching 18th century counterpoint. In terms of actual examples of fugues and inventions, I will be totally transparent and say I'm still using the Walter Clavier and the 2-voice inventions and 3-part symphonias as kind of models, but all of the other things that I teach to get students ready to write using those styles that I'm drawing from other composers. So when we're doing sequences and whenever we're looking at points of notation, and all of the different harmonic concepts, the resolution and preparation of suspensions, and just general the idioms that are very specific harmonically to the 18th century. Then I'm drawing from a lot of different composers. But I would love someday to stumble upon a collection of fugues, harpsichord fugues by a woman that we've never heard of before in the 18th century. If they were used as a side-by-side with the Walter Clavier. I haven't found one yet, and no one else has either. If you have, please tell me. I would love to know. I do rely heavily on Bach for big examples, but then my approach then is to supplement everything that's not one of those big examples is then coming from a variety, a lot of other composers who are active. I use Anna Bonn's sonatas quite a lot in my class. She was educated in the Venetian Ospedale della Pietà, which was one of the 4 ospedali in the city of Venice. These were institutions that were famous for their music making for several centuries. Vivaldi famously was the music director at the Pietà for most of his career, so a lot of his music was premiered by the women who were living at the Pietà. Most of the women in the Pietà were foundlings who were dropped through just an anonymous scaffata, a little slot in the door. Most of them were probably illegitimate daughters. And so the lowest members of society for the most part, and then they went on to have these incredible musical careers behind screens, entertaining the most elite, wealthy, and famous visitors from all over Europe. Anna Bonn was not one of the anonymous girls dropped through the slot in the door. There were also opportunities for girls, especially, only girls, to go to Pietà and to be educated as a paying student. So Anna Bonn's parents were professional musicians as a court in Brandenburg, and so they sent her to the Pietà. She tested in. You usually couldn't test into the music program as a paying student until you were 6. She was accepted when she was 4, suggesting that she was incredibly, either that she was very skilled and or that her parents were very wealthy and made a sizable donation. But her parents were court musicians, so I don't think they were probably all that wealthy. They were wealthy enough to pay for her to be educated, but I don't think they were wealthy enough to like buy her a spot at an early age. So she must have been talented, and there was a spot available. They needed a musician at the time. We don't know she's an all too common case of a woman in the 18th century where we kind of lose track of her at a certain point and we never sort of pick up the pieces. It's like Francesca Caccini, we have so much documentation about when she was born and who she studied with and what all of her appointments were and when she published her music, and then once she leaves the Medici court, she just like evaporates and we have no idea, when she died. And it's the same with Anna Bohm. We don't know what happens to her much beyond when she leaves the Pietà. We think she probably went to work with her parents in the Brandenburg court. We have her 2 publications, Opus 1, her flute sonatas, Opus 2, her harpsichord sonatas. She was trained, we know, as a harpsichordist, a composer, and a singer, and after that, she just also sort of vanishes. And so we have her repertoire, we have no images of her, we don't know what she looked like. We just have these 2 surviving publications that happen to be really great 18th century counterpoint teaching tools because her teacher was probably Vivaldi and she writes sequences and they are like the perfect, every time you need a sequence that does a very specific thing, you can find at least 3 examples in every single movement of the sonatas. Like D2 sequences everywhere, you can find them totally diatonic, you can find them chromatic, you can find them modulating, you can find the A2 sequence in all of its different permutations. She doesn't use D3 really very often, if at all, but D2 and A2 were all over the place. And really very satisfying music that is so entrenched and stylized in kind of the 18th century style of her time. So let's just listen. This is an example I use whenever I am teaching the D2 sequence. So here is what this sounds like. Recording a CD of music by Leonardo and another nun living nearby, Leonardo was incredibly prolific. She composed more than 200 works in all the sacred genres of her time, and they were all published, and they all survived, which is all unusual. And one of the most prolific composers living at this time. She also lived a really long time. 84 years is a really long time to live in the 17th century. She was, of course, protected from many ways that women would have died at the time because she was in the convent, so she was a little bit more sheltered from disease and also no risk of dying in childbirth, which was, of course, what shortened the lives of so many women at the time. She's known to be, we think of her as the first woman that we know of who published a book of instrumental sonatas. So her Opus 16 are her instrumental sonatas, but she also has vocal solos and a lot of vocal ensemble pieces. The texts are extraordinary. These are music that would have all been performed at the services of the hour, so lauds and matins, and vespers and compline, etc. It would have been performed in the Eucharistic liturgies that would have been and they were sanctioned by the Pope all the time, so they were constantly like working around the ecclesiastical restrictions of what musical instruments were allowed in a certain year, or what types of music were allowed. So there were these constant games that they were playing. And so she was writing as all of the music that she was essentially allowed to write. And at the same time that she was composing so prolifically, she held every leadership role in the convent. So all the way from when she started as a novice when she was 16 until she died, she was the Mother Superior, the Vicar of the Council. She held every major leadership role. One of the really interesting things about her, we think of nuns as being cloistered and secluded from the world, performing their music behind screens, invisible to the outside. Leonardo became very famous in the city of Novara. There was a book published right around the turn of the 18th century that's essentially like a who's who of Novara. And the author writes like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs about most of the people, and he writes 3 whole pages about Isabella Leonarda and her music. He calls her the muse par excellence of Novara. So her music was known really well throughout the city. And I've been reading all of the prefaces to her collections slowly because my Italian is really terrible. But reading through the collections of these to kind of learn more about her world. And in one of the prefaces to her opuses, she indicates very specifically that she composed the music in the middle of the night, and this is essentially letting the bishop who the music is dedicated to know that she wasn't neglecting her convent responsibilities, because that was supposed to be, right, first and foremost were her convent responsibilities, and music was something that was they weren't really supposed to be doing it, but they were doing it, and it was bringing in money, and so it was a really hard, dance that they were doing for her whole life. Her music is very, very 17th century, honestly, in terms of style, but most of it was published close, at the very end of the 17th century and then right over the turn of the 18th century, and we think that's because there were a ton of, she wrote the music earlier, but there were tons of restrictions in place earlier in her career that prevented her from actually publishing it. And so most of it is very 17th century in style. I like to use her instrumental sonatas whenever I'm teaching points of imitation, because she's really, I have a lot of my counterpoint students, I make them compose a trio sonata movement in the style of Corelli. And I love Isabella Leonarda's points of imitation, and also her canonical, her imitative writing is sometimes strictly canonical, and then sometimes it's a point of imitation, and then the voices diverge at a certain point. And she does really interesting things. I picked really standard things to show you because you probably would start off by teaching something more standard rather than something where you're like, whoa, is that real? Is that a mistake? But this is one where the imitation is strictly canonical. So the continuum of the bass line is separate entity, but the 2 violins, violin 1 comes in and you hear violin 2 and think, okay, point of imitation, fine, except that they actually stay in perfect canon all the way until they get to the end. So this is an example where we look at canon specifically and talk about all of the different ways that she's constructing a melody and a harmonic underpinning that can work to remain canonical the whole time, which is much harder than just writing 4 beats that imitate and then diverging and getting it all to work harmonically and lead to the cadence. So we talk a lot about backwards construction and thinking of how okay, the goal is to get, 2, 6, 5, 5, 1 at the very end of the phrase. Now, how do you write forwards and backwards at the same time so that everything lines up and can get to that point? So here's what this sounds like. Last example is one that I use very specifically for teaching points of imitation, just as a point of imitation rather than as a strict canon. This one is in 4 voices instead of 3, and so always when I'm teaching point of imitation, I'm wanting my students to think about what's the time duration between each voice entering and what is the pitch, the intervallic relationship between each of the voices entering. So you can see we start with violin 2 on a D, and then exactly after 2 bars, we have violin 1 coming in on a G, and then this one is a very regular, predictable pattern. Exactly 2 bars later, then the violone enters on a D, and 2 bars later, the continuo comes in on a G. The imitation, and then we look, of course, at how long the imitation is actually lasting. How long is she able to maintain, or how long does she choose to maintain the strict imitation between the voices, and then, of course, how does she get to a cadence at the end of the example. So quick, let's listen to it. Of course, goes on from there. And again, as I said, this one is a very, very standard interval in terms of what is, it's the predictable interval of pitch and also the predictable interval of time, which is not always so predictable in terms of the pitch and the time. And so it's a very, especially if we think about Corelli, Opus 1 or Opus 3, I can't remember now, that I used that was published just like 3 years after this, and we look at them as kind of ideas of trio sonatas and points of imitation. Corelli is incredibly regular and predictable. Every point of imitation works. I love Corelli's music, but every point of imitation is the same. And when you look at something like this and you see all of the different ways that she's setting up points of imitation at different pitch intervals than you would expect, different time intervals than you would expect, at essentially the same time, it's a really, I think it maybe needs to turn into a paper, but I haven't thought it through enough to think about what kind of paper it would be. But so that's kind of an overview of some of my favorite examples. I would love to open it up for the last 15 minutes for questions or conversation or dialogue, what your experiences have been, if you've been incorporating classical examples by historical composers from underrepresented groups in your classes, anything you feel like sharing at the end of a very long day. Yeah.
The first thing that pops into my mind is the immense opportunity this provides theorists, musicologists, and performers for all this unknown repertoire to be now studied and performed.
Yeah.
Are you seeing people getting interested in doing this? Like, I would love to see. Well, yeah, Teresa Carreño, for example, is.
I was so excited when I saw what your poster presentation was going to be.
Are you seeing that in the field becoming more and more prominent? Are you hearing? Well, you're just talking about your recording project with Isabel Leonardo, but are you seeing other performers start to record some of this music?
Yeah, I've especially been seeing it, at Peabody, all the undergraduates do a junior and a senior recital, and the grad students, the master's students do a recital every year, and the DMA students do one every semester. And so I especially see it in my students talking to me about repertoire they're going to program on their recitals, because almost everyone who's taken one of my undergraduate classes and is interested in this will write to me and be like, okay, so I'm programming my senior recital and I really want to play violin sonata by, an indigenous composer. Who do you suggest? Or I've got a DMA recital and I really want a piano piece. What might you suggest? So I'm seeing a lot of my students and other people's, and students I haven't had, but I look at all the recital programs posted at Peabody as I'm walking to my classroom every day, and seeing that the repertoire on student recitals especially is really changing, which I think is exciting because that's the future of who will be programming recitals as professionals whenever they graduate, and who will maybe become board members of Baltimore Symphony or other major institutions and create some change in the flagship institutions that get most of the grant funding from the state. So I'm seeing a lot of change. The recording projects I think are so much harder, which I find to be frustrating. I've been trying to get grant funding for 3 years to get recordings from other examples on our website. If anyone knows of anything, please email me. But it's much harder to get funding for recording projects and to get people, yeah, I think that's a harder sell. But for concert programming itself, I've seen a big shift, which I think is really exciting and fun. Like every time I see Barbara Strossi programming something, I'm like, yes, someone else is doing Barbara Strossi, which is amazing. Yeah.
Just one quick comment and a short question, and then I'll stop. I thought the comment is how great of Paris Opera to appoint Joseph Boulogne. I was surprised at that fact alone.
Yeah.
And so that's just a comment. And the other thing is for Samuel Coleridge Taylor.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he did some fusion work.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of that?
Yeah,
I'm
he
curious.
has pieces that he calls, I think he calls them African dances. I think they're piano works, or at least the score I use as a piano score. It might be a reduction of something else, but I think it's 3 African dances. And I don't know, you are so much more of an expert in African music, so you would be able to,
And I'm not.
you would look at them much more than me and
But-
figure out kind of what types of.
Yeah, I'd be so interested to see how that works.
Yeah, he talked a lot about wanting to incorporate that aspect of his heritage into his musical practice. He never knew his father. His mother was pregnant with him, and her parents were very upset about this, and so she stayed in London with her parents and raised Samuel, and Samuel's father went back as a businessman from Sierra Leone, and he left England and didn't stay and went back because they were forbidden from being married in England. And so he never, I don't know that he ever really interacted with his direct family in Africa, but that he was very interested in his African origins. And I don't know, I haven't read enough to know how much he did kind of ethnomusicological studies or what his exposure or access would have been around the turn of the 20th century.
That's like a whole
different
book project,
yeah,
right?
that's a whole project. Someone else, right?
Yeah.
Someone who knows about those things.
But that's what I'm saying. It goes back to my first question. This is a huge opportunity for all of these cases.
There's so much. I mean, there are 67 composers in my book, and that's just because I was limited by SUNY on the number of pages they were willing. Understandably, right? But there's no I don't have really much time anymore, but I could add another 500 examples every year to this website, and if I had time and resources, right? Because there's just so much repertoire and so many opportunities for tons and tons of research and performance and recording. Yeah.
It's just so many things. The Bologna thing reminded me tangentially of Mendelssohn getting denied the appointment in the Singing Academy, suspected because of his Jewish heritage, but there was no protesting that time at least. But speaking of what you're talking about with all these extra opportunities, when the pandemic hit, lost my teaching job, thought I would never teach theory again, went back to school, got a master's in piano at the University of Idaho. And one of the reasons I picked that school is because it was very close to where I lived. But coincidentally, Aneta Larti is an Albanian pianist that teaches, literally the best teacher I've met in my life. Does a lot of work on expanding pedagogy opportunities, women composers in piano and all that. My goal was, I'll go there and I'll do a piano, my graduate recital will be only works by women. And she said, no, you absolutely cannot do that, because nobody is going to know how difficult any of these pieces are. That they're all so poorly known that if my CV is Carreño and then Hensel and then Zanowska, then
no one will know you could play the Chopin Ballade.
Exactly, which I can't. But yeah, but it's that sort of thing. Like that, it's so, and that's why it's so important. You talked about this colleague of yours who never heard and didn't. It's so important that we not only work with our students about this, but also speak with our colleagues.
Yeah.
I had a colleague who conducted the symphony at a school I taught at, and I found out about this great grant for if you perform orchestral works by women, they'll give you a whole bunch of money. I don't think it exists anymore. And I said, you should look at the Fanny Hensel's string or her overture.
Yeah.
And he asked me if she had a website. Right? He's my age. He's not like an old fuddy-duddy or something like that. He went to the same kind, never even heard of her.
Wow. Right.
Yeah. I wanted him to be fired, but they wouldn't do it. But yeah, so speaking with colleagues and stuff is also super, super important. Because Peabody, yeah, I mean, if you got a degree from Peabody, I don't even have to look at what you played because you're a god. If you go to the University of Idaho, it's not the same story. So these sort of middle tier graduate programs where we can't put what we want is because the people who might hire us don't know who those people are.
Yeah, that's just another like barrier to all of the gatekeeping that happens.
And it hadn't even occurred to me until like I was a semester into the program.
It seems to me that the backdoor through the funding stuff is actually not to do it to try to fund it from a like arts organization performance, but to get it funded through educational funding opportunities like the Mellon Higher Education Grant,
Right.
which is like substantive and exactly trying to like there's a whole branch of it which is about social justice and disciplinary knowledge. So like that is the perfect thing for a project like this.
Yeah. Other questions, comments?
I just, I really appreciate this. I don't think I ever told you, but after we met at S&T a couple years ago, it was like, what was it, like early November?
Yeah.
I had a month left of my grad review class, and I came back and I walked into class and was like, all right, we're changing everything that we're doing. And like, I completely revised the rest of the class, and it's been like this revision, and I've had them now for a couple years look at the Mangaru. I never know how to say your last name. The sonata, and anyways, and it's interesting because like the theme is just like this. It's something about it strikes me as inherently like female because it's like she talks about this and then she interrupts herself and she goes over here and then she does this and it's like this like 32 bars and it's like this really long like conversational like theme or melody that just like goes on and then finally she gets to the end of it, but then it goes on a little bit more and then it's like, so the students have a really hard time deciphering it because, which is like, they really have to lock into like where it ends because it doesn't act like a 16-bar straightforward question answer thing. It's
Can
like.
you see the composition again?
What? How do you? I don't even know.
Are you talking about Hélène de Montguiraud?
Yes. Thank you. Montguiraud.
M-O-N-T something?
Yeah, M-O-U-N-T.
M-O-U-N-T.
Yeah, she's French.
I have engraved at least I think I've engraved the first movement. If you don't have it, if anybody wants it.
Yes, please.
Oh,
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Yeah. So yeah, it's a neat sonata. It's very like.
Yeah, she has like a book of sonatas and they're all.
Yeah.
I find the last movements of her sonatas to have the more straightforward forms. Interestingly enough.
Okay.
The first movements are like, where is the transition? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And the third movements are like, it's right there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I think the F major sonata that I read, the third movement is in the, I can't remember.
The one on the website, I've just been
There's
using
one on the website, a different one on the website.
Yeah, the one on the website's the number 2
Yeah.
in E flat.
Sorry, loads and loads of things I'm going to ask you about. The first piece that I started teaching regularly in the core is the Clara Schumann Nocturne, with the wonderful big old cadential expansion in the first phrase. It's like 13 measures, and it goes through 2 different augmented sixth chords, and has a Neapolitan chord in it, and it's really gnarly for like late chromatic. A question that I got, I think the first 3 times I taught it, that I don't get from any of the composers, and I'm curious if you get this question a lot too, is, was this an intuitive thing for her, or did she think this all out? And I feel like I don't get asked that when I'm teaching Beethoven, but I get that when I teach her music. And I mostly taught this in the Northeast, like the rural Northeast, so it might be a regional thing. I was curious if you bump into that same sort of thinking, that because it's a woman, it must be intuitive,
Right.
you know, rather than educated.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and no one has specifically asked me that.
Okay.
I've been asked lots of other interestingly, potentially inappropriate questions. But, that's not one that I have been asked before, but that is a really interesting idea, whether we often think of women, especially the 19th century idea of the woman as interpreter rather than as creator, and as you would say, intuiting rather than being educated.
Yeah. And how do you cope with the somewhat inappropriate questions?
It depends on the context.
Yeah.
My students have largely not asked anything too extraordinary for the most part. Undergraduates, grad students sometimes can ask things discussion seminar so that we can
Yeah.
like steer the ship a little bit. But in a, you know, for undergrad, it's so, because I mostly need to know that they know like where the cadences are. There's not a lot of time
Right.
to sort of talk about a few things, for better or for worse.
This is amazing. I think
Yeah,
it's an
thank
awesome
you.
resource.
I'm glad that it's been useful for so many people. I didn't expect that when I published it, so I'm really happy that this is the way that it turned out. Well, thank you so much for your time and for this whole weekend. It's been really fun.